This video is sponsored by Wren. Stick around to the end to learn how you can help fight climate change. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm headed back over to Genesis Apologetics to see what they've been up to recently. And it seems like they've mostly shifted the focus of their channel to be aimed at children in the 8 to 10-year-old age group. Since I have a kid in that group, I thought I'd see what they're trying to get them with.
Today, we are going to talk about the global flood. Was it a real event or just a fairy tale?
Little column A, little column B. The story of Noah's Ark is basically a fairy tale, but it's likely based on a real flood. About 7,500 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the Black Sea was a body of freshwater, collecting glacial meltwater that drained through it into the Mediterranean. Then, as sea levels rose and more glaciers melted, the path that the meltwater took shifted to the North Sea, which then left the Black Sea as an inland lake that was losing water to evaporation. Global sea levels continued to climb, and there was only a relatively small rocky sill in the Bosporus Strait in Istanbul that was the only thing keeping the Mediterranean out of the Black Sea. Eventually, it spilled over this barrier and is estimated to have flooded the region for at least 300 days, with a daily volume of water 200 times the amount that goes over Niagara Falls every day. That's a pretty catastrophic flood, for which there is actual evidence, and it lasted about the same amount of time as Noah's flood was supposed to have lasted, and it was far enough in the past for the authors of the Noah's Ark story that it could have easily undergone some legendary growth before being recorded. And there is actual evidence for this in sedimentary deposits from the area, like the actual kind of evidence for a flood that we would expect if there were actually a flood.
Now, sadly, some people think that the flood never happened.
Well, I just described how it did happen, but yeah, it didn't happen in the way that the Bible described, that's for sure.
Let's start with the Ark. Now, when people hear the term Noah's Ark, they often think of little cartoon arks like this one. Now, it's cute, but the problem is, it's nothing like the real Ark.
Yeah, it's not. For one, if there was a boat that rescued a bunch of animals during the flood that actually did happen, it probably wouldn't have included bears, giraffes, sloths, and other animals that either were not indigenous to the area or else wouldn't be practical or useful in a flood scenario.
Can you see any problems? Well, here's what I came up with. First of all, this Ark is way too small. There's no way Noah could fit all the animals on this Ark.
Okay, this is a whole category of argumentation that I just don't even comprehend. Assuming the Noah's Ark story was true, the kids' books versions of it are not accurate to what the Ark would have been. Great. Now, why does nobody ever argue about that with anything else related to kids' books? I read my kids a book called Older Than the Stars sometimes, and you know what? They did go out of their way to make sure that everything was scientifically accurate. However, there are still some, choices that they made that are probably, I don't think this is what the Big Bang actually looked like. And as much as they were striving for scientific accuracy, I don't think that physicists would agree that these are the bits that were born in the bang when the world began is really the most accurate way that you could describe the Big Bang. Now, do you think that I'm worried that my kids will one day just stop believing in the Big Bang because the book Older Than the Stars described it in less than entirely accurate scientific detail? No, because it's a kid's book. It's meant to be whimsical and fun. But if you really want visual accuracy in your children's books, how about we cut it out with the white Jesus that's found all over the place? Because that's definitely not accurate. I don't even hear apologists complain about that one for some reason.
And why is everybody smiling? The flood was a sad event.
Yeah, you know what? That's one that I can actually get behind. It's kind of fucked up that we write a bunch of cutesy, whimsical children's books about what is purportedly the worst genocide event in world history. And these whimsical children's books try to paint the perpetrator of this genocide as one of the protagonists of the story. It's quite preposterous, not to mention just, gross.
And then, what about these giraffes? Why are they floating in midair like that?
I know this is you trying to be funny, and it is amusing to me that whoever put this together was apparently just copying and pasting animal images into the Ark image and couldn't figure out how to get the giraffes to fit, so just made them hover. But the funnier thing here is that we have two bovines represented, and they both appear to be cows. That is, they are both female. There's a lesbian cow couple on your boat.
But the biggest problem with this picture is that this ark is the wrong shape. This is what's going to happen when the first big wave comes.
I mean, considering the fact that creationist researchers have calculated that in order to account for all the changes that you guys like to say happened to the Earth during the flood, like the separation of the continents for instance, enough energy would have to have been released to turn the entire Earth into a giant molten ball for millions of years. So I think you've got bigger problems than just what shape the boat is when the wave hits.
The real ark was huge. It was over 510 feet long. Now that's as long as 1.5 football fields. It was 84 feet wide and as tall as a 4-story building.
Which is tiny considering what we're supposed to believe was being put in it.
So it would have plenty of room for the animals and all the food they needed to bring.
Yeah, it really wouldn't have though. Like, even if we just assume that it's enough space for the animals and food, we're still left with a scenario where the 8 people that you guys think took care of all of these animals would have to spend about 17.5 hours out of every day doing nothing but carrying buckets of poop that needs to be removed. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but I will leave a card to another video that explains exactly how I got that number.
Speaking of animals, some people say that there's no way that Noah could have fit all those animals on the ark.
I mean, that is true, but for the record, my 17.5 hours of poop scooping was assuming that there were only 7,000 animals on the ark, which is one of the lower estimates even among creationists. Answers in Genesis occasionally says that it's 16,000 animals, but in their more recent posts they seem to prefer the 7,000 number as well. Not sure why they're comfortable dropping the total number of animals by more than half when they complain that naturalist scientists keep changing things instead of sticking to their guns. But hey, even if we're generous and assume that their latest numbers are correct, and that the ark would not only fit all the animals but also all the supplies, it's still completely unmanageable for them.
Is that true? Well, let's take a closer look. So let's start with this. What animals did Noah need to bring? Now, here's what God said. God said that he would send 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal that moves along the ground to him to be saved.
Well, that depends on which part of the story we're reading. In Genesis 6, it's 2 of everything, but in Genesis 7, we get 7 pairs of all the clean animals and birds, and 1 pair of all the unclean animals. You can just go ahead and ignore the fact that it's clearly 2 different but related stories being told simultaneously. It's okay, we promise. It's not actually a contradiction.
What's a kind?
Great question! That will undoubtedly be left unanswered except for a vague appeal to, well, we can already see it in the graphic. Bears go in the bear kind, the various cats go in the cat kind, etc. Never mind that a lot of these are demonstrably related to each other, and so have to have a common ancestor that was neither bear nor dog, to take 2 categories from your chart.
A kind is a group of animals that are closely related.
You just fail to consistently define what it means to be closely related, because if you did, then you'd come to the inevitable realization that we, human beings, are ape kind, as we are more closely related to chimpanzees than the chimpanzees are to the other great apes. I'm skipping this kind crap, it's been done to death at this point, which realistically all the creationist claims have, but I just don't feel like getting into this one, so I'm not going to. Suck it. Okay, maybe I'll find a card to a video where I did if you really want that. Long story short, the main takeaway from the kinds thing is that it forces young Earth creationists to embrace incredibly rapid, large-scale evolution in order to explain how such a small number of animals diversified into all of the ones that we see today. Also, the Bible explicitly forbids farmers from breeding their cattle with a different kind in Leviticus 19. So it seems weird for God to prohibit something that's not physically possible anyway.
Here's a question. Were dinosaurs on the ark?
Simple answer, no, because there was no ark. But yeah, in your theology, the Bible categorizes things in such a way that you end up stuck trying to figure out exactly how all these extinct animals were accounted for on the ark as well, which only serves to make the story even more ridiculous than it already was.
Remember what God said, that he would send 2 of every kind of animal that moves along the ground to Noah to be saved. Do dinosaurs move along the ground? Yes, they do. So according to the Bible, dinosaurs were on the ark.
The fun thing here is that this is where evolution could actually kinda salvage the story. If Noah only had to have two of every kind of animal, and then they evolved into the modern animals after the flood, then at least the theropod dinosaur kind could be represented by the birds that were already supposed to be on the ark. But unfortunately for creationists, while the idea that 3,500 species of animals represented by 7,000 individuals could evolve into the 6.5 million species of land animals into just 4,000 years since the flood is completely plausible to them, adding in also birds or theropod dinosaurs is just a step too far.
But wait a minute, how could they fit? They were so huge. Whoa, big fella, careful. Actually, did you know that there are only about 80 dinosaur kinds, and most of them were no bigger than a horse when full grown?
Sure, whatever. This doesn't actually help your case, at all, but go for it. God made Noah take an extra 160 individual animals that were destined to go extinct right after the flood, just for shits and giggles or whatever.
What about the really big ones like the sauropods? Well, we know from the fossil record that the big ones started out small, so God could have sent babies like this guy. Hello, little fella.
This sounds nice in theory, but in practice, young animals are much more difficult to care for than older ones. Even though they may eat less, they need to be fed more frequently, and they are often more susceptible to diseases, and would just generally be less hardy than an adult, so stuffing it on an overcrowded boat in the middle of the most violent storm in the history of the Earth probably wouldn't have gone very well and would have increased the burden of caring for the ark animals by a tremendous amount. Remember, these people are already spending 17 and a half hours out of every day doing nothing but shoveling shit. Actually, no, that's wrong. When I did that calculation, it only accounted for 10 minutes per animal, which, given how big the ark is and how far they'd have to walk with their buckets for most of them, is extremely generous. That's not enough time to actually shovel the shit as well, that's just carrying the buckets. So they've only got 6.5 hours in the day left for feeding and watering all the animals, doing the actual shoveling part of the shoveling shit, and, sleeping? Assuming they only get 2 hours of sleep per night, they have 4.5 hours left out of every day for taking care of these animals. With 8 people and around 7,000 animals on the ark, that's 875 animals per person. So they all have to feed, water, clean the stable, and everything for 195 animals every hour in order to keep up. That's 3 animals per minute. And if we're generous and assume that feeding and cleaning up after a pair of animals takes the exact same amount of time as a single animal, we now get to cut that number in half, so that's 1.5 pairs of animals every minute. It takes longer than that to take care of an animal when all the food and supplies are stored conveniently, specifically to take care of just that animal. But these guys have to run across a pretty big boat in order to get to where the food and other supplies would be kept, which, yeah, might be convenient for a few of the animals, but for most, that would be too far of a trip to keep up.
Okay, so back to the question. How many animals did Noah need to bring? Well, it's hard to be sure, but based upon the latest estimates, it's about 7,000 animals.
The latest estimates, which keep getting revised. AIG used to say 16,000, now they say 7,000. And Genesis Apologetics is basically discount AIG. All their material is pretty much ripped directly from AIG, so I assume that they went through a similar revision in the not-too-distant past. Ordinarily, this isn't something I would even bother to bring up. I am all about being able to change your mind when presented with new data. That is a good thing that I would like to encourage. The problem here is, well, for starters, they didn't revise their number based on new data. They approach everything with their desired conclusion already in mind, and are constantly looking for ways to make it look more plausible. Lowering the number of animals required on the ark meets that goal, so they will latch onto anything they can to get that number down. But more importantly, their website is plagued with article after article complaining about how scientists just keep changing their story every time they find new data. The evolutionary story is changing daily, with each new discovery and previously known facts are being discarded constantly. But God's word endures forever, says one article about how the Neanderthal story keeps changing, written by Ken Ham himself. In the secular view, where all matter originated by chance from nothing, there is no ultimate cause or reason for anything that happens, and explanations are constantly changing, so there is no basis for science, says another article written by Bodie Hodge. Seen here being served dinner by a guy he had no clue would go on to make a living off of debunking claims that he makes for a living. The best evidence for evolution keeps changing. At the Scopes monkey trial, Piltdown Man was the main evidence for human evolution. While evolutionary scientists keep getting it wrong, the Bible never changes, says an article complaining about the fact that scientists stopped promoting a fraud as evidence for evolution once it was discovered to be a fraud. Like, seriously, would the preferred action to take in that instance really have been to just cover it up and pretend it was legit in order to avoid change? The whole Piltdown Man thing is supposed to be just an example of a time when those evolutionists fell for a trick, because they just want to see evidence for evolution everywhere. And if you want to use it that way, fine, go for it, but you gotta stop before you get to the point where science progressed. Because it was science progressing that helped us discover that it was a fraud. I mean, you can go there if you want, but then you have to dance around the fact that it was primarily the increasing in our understanding of human evolution that led to Piltdown Man being re-examined. But also, and more importantly, to fault them for discarding a fraud once it was discovered to be a fraud suggests that you consider such things to be a fault in the first place. Which then leads me to wonder which aspects of creationism you know to be fraudulent, but are still defending because changing your position is seen as worse than believing in the literal fraud. But then, we know you aren't consistent with that. This is demonstrated by the changing number of how many animals were required on Noah's Ark.
Let's talk about the flood. Now, when I was a child, I remember singing songs about the flood. It rained for 40 days and all that stuff. And that's fun. But here's the problem. The real flood was nothing like that. It was much more than just a rainstorm. It was a catastrophic event for the whole planet, and it lasted for 370 days.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to be pedantically correcting a children's song, maybe don't pick the duration of the rain, since the Bible agrees with the song that it rained for 40 days. You even have that Bible verse on the screen as you're saying that, in the third box.
The real flood included earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and massive tsunamis all over the world.
Yep. To a point where even creationist researchers have come out and said that creationists need to stop trying to explain everything in terms of how it could be naturalistically plausible. Just say that God messed with physics, because it's physically impossible. That's what geophysicist John Baumgartner said in a paper published in Volume 27 of Creation Research Society Quarterly. Quote, "It is the author's suspicion that God modified some single fundamental aspect of the natural order, which in turn affected all of the fundamental forces. The author believes that the sooner the community of scientists who are aware of the integrity of the Bible is convinced the system of natural law that normally describes the orderly behavior of the cosmos cannot have been time invariant, the sooner genuine progress will be made in establishing the framework that accounts for Noah's flood and the geological history of our planet in a robust and satisfying way. To paraphrase, the sooner we ditch the idea that God made the flood happen in a way that works within the laws of physics, the sooner we can make progress in figuring out specifically which aspects of the laws of physics God changed in order to make it happen. This also works against the apologetic argument that suggests that atheists have no basis for assuming the laws of physics will remain constant, while Christians do, because they were made to be constant by God. Like, it's not the atheist worldview that suggests that the laws of physics literally can change on a whim, as long as that whim belongs to God.
Okay, so is there any evidence for all of this?
No, there isn't. And in fact, there is a plethora of evidence against it from basically every scientific field you could possibly think of. Geology? Yup, there's no record of a global flood. Archaeology? Yup, there's evidence of civilizations that survived through the flood without seeming to have noticed it. Chemistry? Radiometric dating. Physics? Radiometric dating too, but also that whole thing about the amount of energy needed to account for everything in the flood being enough to vaporize the oceans and turn the Earth molten. Biology? No evidence of such a severe genetic bottleneck in all species, or any species really. Cheetahs are the closest you'll get, and their bottleneck event was about 6,000 years pre-flood, or 4,000 years before the universe existed according to creationists. And their bottleneck never got as severe as only having 2 individuals left. Also, the evolution that would be required to diversify from what was on the Ark to what we have today would have to have been on an unimaginably fast scale. Astronomy? Okay, maybe this doesn't directly disprove the flood itself, but the fact that we can see photons that have to have been traveling for over 13 billion years means that, well, they have to be at least 13 billion years old, which also means that the universe they're traveling through has to be at least 13 billion years old. And I could keep going.
Yes, there is. Let's look at a few examples. So the first line of evidence is the fossil record.
Right, I forgot about paleontology, because the fossil record shows a clear picture of evolution over millions of years, not one single catastrophic flood event.
Now what is that? We have billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the world.
Yes, we do. And when you oversimplify it like that, you might think, hey, that sounds like a flood. But unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. For starters, there is a shit ton of organic limestone. There is so much of it that it is physically impossible for it to have formed all from the remains of organisms who died in the flood. The Earth just doesn't have the resources to have sustained that large of a population, and it never has.
So why do I think that the fossils were made by the flood?
Easy. Because you've taken an overly simplistic view of them. Yeah, actually, more realistically, it's probably because you started with the Bible is correct about everything it says as a conclusion, and so had to find a way to fit things that the Bible is wrong about into it. And the easiest way to do that with the fossils is to ignore all the details and just repeat the billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the Earth mantra.
With billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the Earth.
There's a reason that line got turned into a children's song.
Well, here's a few reasons. First of all, when you find most fossils, they're in these massive boneyards like this one here.
Is it that most fossils are in massive boneyards? Or is it that a massive boneyard is significantly easier to find than one individual fossil, thereby creating a selection bias? Also, in order to form a fossil, the organism needs to be buried shortly after death, and the kinds of events that are likely to bury an organism while it dies are also the kinds of events that kill lots of organisms at the same time. Things like volcanic eruptions, mudslides, and yes, even floods.
And in some of these graveyards, they've got sea creatures and land creatures all mixed in together.
One of the primary bone beds I found when searching for this is the Agate Fossil Beds of Nebraska, or the Agat Fossil Beds of Nebraska, or the Agat Fossil Beds of Nebraska, or the Agay Fossil Beds of Nebraska. I looked up how to pronounce it, and everybody says something different, so But they are claimed by creationists to contain a mixture of rhinos, three-toed horses, camels, wild boars, seashells, and fish. The problem is the only non-creationist site that I can find that lists what fossils are found there only lists the Dinohyus, what they called wild boars, Stenomylus, what they called camels, and Menoceras, which they called rhinos. There are other fossil deposits in Nebraska that contain things like turtles alongside land animals, but there are two problems with that. Let's start with the name. It's called the Ashfall fossil bed. The clue is right there in the name. This one I do know how to pronounce. Ashfall. It was a bunch of animals that were killed by ash falling from a supervolcano eruption. That's not very flood-like. This layer was definitely not laid down by water. But also the only water-based organisms represented there are the turtles, which, yeah, a lot of them do prefer to stay in the water full time, but it's not implausible that they could have been buried well out of the water. And also when we look at where this fossil bed is, the land animals were seeking relief from the ash at a watering hole. Just the kind of place where turtles can usually be found hanging out. And funnily enough, there's nothing that would stop land animals from occasionally being buried with marine animals. I'm sure it does happen sometimes, but it's a minority of times. If everything died in the flood, the jumbled up finds would be more common than the neatly separated finds. But unfortunately for creationists, that's just not how it plays out. Also, keep in mind that when I'm talking about jumbled up versus neatly separated here, I'm talking about finding land animals among sea creatures, or vice versa. But they're separated in more than just ecosystem. They're separated in time as well. The older layers are on the bottom, the younger layers are on the top, and there is a firm separation between these layers without there being a single instance of an animal being stuck in between multiple layers, as we would expect to find if all the layers were formed in one single event.
Some fossils, like this fish here, show that they were buried very rapidly. This poor guy was buried in mud when he was eating his lunch.
Yep, he was. And of course, we all know that the only possible way for something to be buried rapidly like that is for the entire planet to be flooded all at once, right? No, of course not. Just because some things got buried rapidly does not mean that they were all buried in the same event.
Finally, when scientists do find complete skeletons, they often show signs of violent death.
Yeah, you know what else they often find on these bones? Signs that they were subject to scavenging, which wouldn't have been possible in the worldwide flood. But even aside from that, often deaths are violent. That's kind of a fact of life. And the types of events that are likely to result in rapid burial also tend to be the types of events that kill things violently. So it stands to reason that most of the things that we find as a result of these violent events will show signs of violent death, since, that's what happened.
And did you know that scientists have found fossils of marine creatures on top of the highest mountains in the world, even Mount Everest?
Why, yes, I did know that. Now, did you know that with the dynamics of a flood, they would deposit such fossils in the low points, not on the high points? Floods remove sediment and debris from the high spots and bring it down low, not the other way around. So finding seashells on the mountaintops, somewhat counterintuitively, is evidence against the flood. Well, if they didn't get there in a flood, how did they get there? The thing is, when we have millions of years to work with, we have time for things to change very slowly. In the case of the Himalayas, the material that makes them up used to be on the seafloor millions of years ago. As the Indian tectonic plate crashed into the Eurasian tectonic plate, the material from the seafloor got scraped off and pushed upward, forming the mountain range that we know today.
When you think about it, all of these different fossils point to a global flood.
No, quite the contrary. That's only where they point if you don't think about it. If you do think about it, like at all, and do any amount of actual research into these various phenomena, you'll realize that they actually show pretty conclusively that there was no global flood.
All right, evidence number 2, geologic layers of the Earth. Now, have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? If not, I hope you do someday. It is really cool. Well, anyway, if you haven't, hopefully you've seen pictures, but you'll see these layers in the Earth.
Yes, and those layers are more evidence against a flood. If they had all formed in the same event, it would not be distinct and separate layers. It would be one big layer, a conglomerate layer to be specific, and it would be roughly sorted with the larger grains of sediment near the bottom and the finer grains of sediment at the top. Since that's not at all what we see, we can say pretty conclusively that they did not form in one single worldwide event.
Now, some people will say that these layers took millions of years to form.
Because they did.
But many creation scientists say that they were formed during the flood.
Yes, notice that it's just the Christian ones who say that. If there was actual evidence for that, you'd expect at least the occasional non-Christian scientist to come to that conclusion. See, the thing is, if we hypothetically wipe out humanity on Earth, and then sometime in the future aliens show up and start studying the planet, they would never conclude from the data that there was a worldwide flood in our planet's history. They would come to the millions of years conclusion, though. Now, without the motivated reasoning that creationism provides, you don't reach creationist conclusions, which suggests that creationism is just wrong.
Why? Well, here's a clue. When you go around the world, you will see these layers of rock, and they're bent. And it's not just one or two, they are everywhere. And these are massive layers. Some of these are hundreds of feet thick, and they're bent like they were really soft.
Yep, they sure do look like that. And do you know what you find in these bent layers 100% of the time? Fractures. They don't bend without breaking. Now, sometimes the fractures are small enough to only be seen through a microscope, but they are still there. Now, the creationist argument is that these rocks bent before they had completely solidified while they were forming, and that it's impossible for rocks to bend after they've solidified because they'd just be too brittle and would snap and fracture. Well, aside from the fact that 100% of these bent rock formations do have fractures in the places you would expect fractures to form while they were being put under the kinds of stress that would bend them like that, it's also entirely possible to bend normally brittle things if they are warmed up first. As an example, for a previous video, I went through the process of heating up a crayon to almost its melting point, then bending it, then letting it cool, and I ended up with a crayon that was bent almost completely in half with very little damage. Just like we see in these bent rocks. So, long story short, when these rocks were located deeper down in the earth where there was a lot of heat and pressure, they were softened enough to bend with only minor fracturing.
Well, rock doesn't bend, so the only way that this could happen is that the layers were laid down during the flood, and when they were still soft, they were bent by the movements of the earth.
Definitely not the only way that could have happened. This is akin to the jet fuel doesn't burn that hot argument for why 9/11 was an inside job.
Finally, there's the flood legends. Did you know that there are over 270 flood legends from all over the world?
And did you know that in human history there have been way more than 270 devastating local floods all over the world? And did you know that all of the flood legends happened in places that experience semi-regular flooding? Almost like people write stories about things that they are familiar with or something.
And a lot of them have similarities to the story in the Bible.
Only if you ignore all the massive differences.
So this one's in Hawaii. And it talks about after the death of the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place to live. And there was only one good man left. And his name was, check this out, Nuhu. Sounds a lot like Noah to me.
Yeah, Hawaii has that flood myth. And Nu'u certainly does start with the same letter as Noah. Really, for this one, if you want to go after the similarities, you should probably have pointed out that Nu'u made sacrifices on a mountaintop after the flood, and then a god slides down on a rainbow to tell him that he sacrificed to the wrong god. At least then you've added in the sacrifices and rainbows as similarities. Of course, in this particular instance, the similarities are most likely due to early Christian missionaries over-exaggerating the similarities to Noah's flood and downplaying the differences. I mean, sure, the Pacific Island cultures probably did have a bunch of flood legends. Well, scratch the probably, they did have a bunch of flood legends, but because of the nature of how these particular stories spread, the earliest accounts that we have of them come from the Christian missionaries to those islands, and so it's hard to determine how much cultural contamination that happened there. But hey, let's take a look at a couple of other Pacific Island flood myths, shall we? And I think I'll open with a blanket apology for the fact that I am definitely going to butcher the names in these stories, so I am so sorry about that. I will do my best. First, from one Maori tradition, we have Ruatapu, who used his elder brother's sacred comb and was chastised by his father for this transgression. To get back at his dad, he tricked a bunch of his brothers into his canoe and sank it in the middle of the ocean. The brother whose comb he used survived with the help of a whale. Ruatapu then convinced the gods of the tides to destroy the land and its inhabitants. The brother who was saved by a whale fled to high ground and was saved by the goddess Moakuramanu. Ruatapu died in his own flood, and his bowels then became the first jellyfish. Another Maori flood myth holds that Tawaki, the demigod of thunder and lightning, caused a flood to destroy the village that his two jealous brothers-in-law lived in. He tipped off his people to relocate their village to the top of the mountain. Now, aside from a bunch of people dying in water, do either of these myths sound like the Noah story? No, they don't. Given how common floods are as a natural disaster, and given how common it is for people to tell stories of such events, and for those stories to grow and develop over time, I'd honestly be more surprised if there weren't any with similarities to the Noah story than I am that there are a handful that sound superficially similar.
And in Chinese, they have a legend of the father of their civilization. History records that he and his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters, escaped a great flood, and that they were the only ones that survived.
That's not quite true. And by not quite, I mean not true at all. This iteration of the Chinese flood myth originates with a book by an American author named Byron Nelson, who claims to be telling the Chinese flood story. Now, there is actually a Chinese flood story, the Shanhai Qing, but the differences between that and Nelson's Fuhi story are way too big to be ignored. In the Shanhai Qing, the flood lasted for 2 generations. A great flood came, and a being named Kun stole the substance of creation from the great god so that he might dam the waters. Now, the great god did want the waters to be dammed, but he was angry that Kun didn't wait to be told to do it, so he had him killed. Kun eventually came back to life and gave birth to Yu, who then finished the damming when the great god finally got around to commanding it. Throughout this whole thing, people are still living, albeit under a good deal of hardship. It didn't wipe out the entire civilization, it just made life incredibly difficult for them. So yeah, the ancient Chinese flood legend is extraordinarily similar to the Noah story. As long as we go with the version that was written by a 20th century American and ignore the versions written by the ancient Chinese. And just as a blanket disclaimer, we're dealing with oral traditions from ancient cultures here that weren't written down until they had been in circulation for sometimes hundreds of years. So if I've got some details wrong, it's not necessarily that I've got the details wrong, although that is a strong possibility. It's that there are so many different versions of the story that you likely just heard the story as told by a different source than I did. Though also, like I said, I'm not exactly an expert on ancient mythology, so if I've made any terribly egregious errors, I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments.
Now, according to the Bible, there were 8 people on board. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Same as this story. In fact, this story is so embedded in Chinese culture that their word for large ship consists of the symbols for 8-person and boat.
Well, again with the disclaimer that I'm not an expert on the Chinese language, but from what I've been able to find, well, firstly, you have the claim itself wrong. The claim is supposed to be that the Chinese glyph for ship is made up of pictographs for vessel, 8, and mouth. Adding large onto it adds a whole new character for the adjective. Second, the character is made up of 2 parts. The part that's on the left is meant to look kinda like what it's talking about. In this case, a boat, specifically the canoe-style boat. The characters on the right, rather than having any significant meaning, are actually phonetic in nature, meaning that the word ship is pronounced similar to how one would pronounce divide mouth. Not that the word for ship has anything to do with the dividing of mouths. Also, again, this is me, someone who knows a grand total of 1 phrase in Chinese that is incredibly rude and would likely get me into a lot of trouble. So I am entirely unsure about my interpretation of someone talking about how that character came about. But one thing I am certain about is that this guy is also wrong. Now, he goes into summary mode, so I'm skipping most of it, but I do just want to touch on this.
Secondly, and this is really important, God hates sin and he'll judge it. So we really need to do our best to follow what God tells us to do.
Keep in mind, this video is explicitly targeted at kids that are about 8 to 10 years old. He's just spent 10 minutes talking about how the Noah's Ark story shouldn't be represented as a happy moment because it was terrible. Now he finishes up with, God hates sin, and this is the kind of stuff he does to the people that sin. When people talk about suffering from religious trauma, this is the kind of shit they're talking about. As kids, they're told stories of that time when God flipped his shit and killed everyone on the planet because they sinned. By the way, you're a sinner and you were born a sinner and you'll never be able to stop sinning. You'd better do your best to do what God tells you to do, or else, well, you know what happens to people who sin. Now, love God, who we just told you hates sin and then emphasized how sinful you are. This whole thing amounts to emotional manipulation. Speaking of catastrophic weather events, today's video is sponsored by Wren. Wren is a public benefit corporation that provides you with a simple and effective way to make a difference in the climate crisis through the funding of carbon offset projects. On their site, you answer a few simple questions to calculate your carbon footprint, which they then turn into a dollar amount that would be needed to offset the carbon that you use. In my case, since joining, I've funded the offset of 10.5 tons of carbon. Wren will then use this money to fund carbon offset projects that have gone through a very thorough vetting process. Wren only funds projects that are able to show exactly how much carbon they are successfully removing from the atmosphere, like the California Biochar Project, which removes dead and flammable trees from California's old growth forests, and then turns them into biochar, which locks away the carbon for thousands of years and has farming benefits. And since biochar is pure carbon, the impact can be measured by simply weighing the biochar itself. Actually directly measuring the impact is important because experts estimate that approximately 85% of carbon offset projects fail to have the impact that they promise. So Wren's commitment to thorough vetting encourages new and growing projects that are looking for funding to actually show the impact that they are having rather than just relying on estimates. And as great as the feeling of being carbon neutral is, we ultimately won't be able to fight climate change on an individual level, which is why a portion of their funds goes towards political action groups, like the Clean Air Task Force, which co-hosted a series of discussions advocating for a carbon neutral future at COP27. Lobby groups like this can be vastly more effective when they can say to the politicians, hey, the public wants to see climate action so badly that they are funding carbon offset projects to the tune of millions of dollars per year. It would greatly help you with re-election if you took a strong stance against climate change. So join me in offsetting your carbon footprint with Wren. The first 100 people who sign up using the link in the description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Tom Debavois. I mean, I've mispronounced everything else in this video so far, may as well get that one as well. He says, God invented logic. You don't believe in God, therefore, you don't understand logic. Well done, Tom. You've successfully constructed one of the worst arguments I've ever seen. And honestly, it takes belief in the supernatural to be able to follow your logic, so maybe you're right. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to follow the link in the description to offset your carbon footprint with Wren. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the guilt-ridden children who grew up to be the atheists that make up my channel. If you'd like to have religious trauma syndrome, which is a real thing that presents with the same symptoms as complex PTSD and is caused by exactly the kind of shit you saw in this video, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! The system of natural law normally just... My God, can you just not write a sentence that long? Fucking verbose motherfucker.
Aga Fossil Beds National Monument is a convergence
Aga?
of natural, cultural, and American history.
What?
Created by Congress in June of 1965, Aga Fossil Beds National Monument is a
Aga Fossil Bed... What?
Agate Fossil Beds National Monument in Harrison, Nebraska.
In pronunciation and written as one, and that's where agate came from.
So agate is the preferred pronunciation, but there is an argument to be made for a gate.
It is usually said as agate. Agate.
Oh, God damn it.